Welcome to Out of the Ether with Brandon Hardy. It's gotten very cold. I think winter is upon us. So to bring myself some holiday cheer, I'm working on a special project. I'll be combining some traditional festive elements in an unusual way to create a classic Christmas staple with a unique and eerie twist.
I recently found this big, beat-up candelabra on Facebook Marketplace. Immediately I saw the potential in it, but I knew I was gonna have to clean it up first. Unfortunately, I recently had a massive hard drive failure, so I lost some of the footage of me cleaning it up. However, what I did was pretty simple. I started by digging out what was left of the old candles from the holders, and then took my heat gun and passed it over the whole candelabra at a high temperature to sort of help melt off whatever wax was remaining. Once I felt like it was pretty clear of wax, I had to address the rust. I wanted to try to prevent the rust from advancing any further, so I hit the whole candelabra with a couple coats of a gloss Rust-Oleum spray paint. I made sure to use a gloss paint because I knew I was ultimately going to paint the candelabra gold, and so a glossy base was going to be the best to ensure that the gold that goes on top looks really shiny. I used Montana brand Gold Chrome Spray Paint, which I've used a couple times already in this series. It's the best spray paint I've found for creating a really genuine, realistic, gold-plated look. Shortly after that, I found these two really unique curved candelabras on Craigslist. Luckily, in addition to being beautiful, they were also inexpensive. Initially, I just picked them up because I really liked them and thought I would find something to do with them, but as I was putting this project together, I realized they were a really great complement to the candelabra that I had already cleaned up, and that I could use them around the base to help round things out and create a more impressive visual statement. These candelabras are made out of black iron, and I decided not to clean these up and paint them just because there was something rustic about them that I really liked. However, I knew I didn't want to use real candles anywhere in this setup. I ordered a couple packs of Votive Candles that go really well with the fake candles that I've used from Genswin in the past, but these are actually from a different company called Home Memory? It's like those two words squished together. Just like the Genswin candles I used, these are coated in real wax, but luckily they have the drips sculpted into the wax already, so they look like they've been burning for a little bit, and you don't necessarily have to go through all the trouble that I went through with my last set of candles to make them look like they've been used. You gotta start by pulling out the little battery tab, which, you know, regular stuff. And then the wick is posable, so you can make sure the flames are pointing straight up. These candles also come with a remote, which I love, especially for something like this where I'm gonna be using a lot of fake candles. You don't wanna have to turn them all on and off individually. You can also set timers from the remote or adjust the brightness, which is great for battery life. I do have to say, something that I've learned and noticed with these candles in particular is that they use those round, flat batteries that are like the size of a quarter, and they can get really expensive. So these are probably not something that I would use for like full-time, year-round candle usage, but I'm just using these for the holiday, so it's fine. Something else that I noticed with these is that the flickering of the candles is a little less randomized than some other fake candles, so if you turn them all on at the same time, sometimes it just looks like they're all pulsing together, so just be aware of that. Then I needed to get candles for the big central candelabra. Because of the proportions of the candelabra, I wanted to get candles that were a little bit shorter than the ones I've used in the past, but Genswin didn't have any, so I found these that were 7 inches tall. Other than that, the main differences between the Genswin candles and these is that these take AA batteries where the Genswin ones take AAAs, and these candles do not have a wax coating on the outside, they are just straight plastic. I had devised a step to help make them look more waxy, but I actually ended up not using it on them because they looked pretty good as they were. You can see these candles also have drips sculpted into them, so they never looked quite as tragically brand new as the original Genswin candles from episode 1. These candles also came with a remote with functions similar to the others: on and off, timer, adjust the brightness, all that good stuff. Because this is going to be the central project of my winter holidays this year, I really wanted to buff out this candelabra and make it look over the top. So I ordered a couple of these intricately carved wood appliques. I wanted my candelabra to have a few extra arms and also just some intricate details that don't exist in the original piece. These appliques are meant to be like glued to furniture or surfaces to make them look more ornate. That's why they're flat on the backside. But if you get mirroring pieces, you can glue them together and make a fully dimensional round object. Before I glue them together, I'm actually going to treat them with a coat of black Flex Seal. This does a couple things. Not only does it prime the wood for painting so that you don't have to do a whole bunch of coats with a paint or primer that just gets absorbed by the wood, but I've also found that the rubber in the Flex Seal does something to the surface of the wood that makes it look like it's no longer wood. It hides all the wood grain and gives the impression that this is cast iron. Now, the candelabra that I'm adding these to is wrought iron and not cast iron, which are different. Wrought iron is when you take bars of metal and bend them into shape, and cast iron is when you melt metal down to its liquid form and pour it into a mold. Because of the differences in these processes, you can get a much more elaborate, intricate look out of cast iron than you usually can get with wrought iron. But that's really expensive, so I'm just faking it and painting it gold so that it just looks expensive. And speaking of the difference between cast iron and wrought iron, I thought it would be fun if there were parts of this candelabra where the wrought iron looked like it was morphing into tree branches. So to create that impression, I'm taking these plastic branches that I got from the floral section of Michael's, pulling them apart, and then spray painting them the same color gold that I've used so far everywhere else on this project. I did end up having to go back and get a second can of gold spray paint for this. I should probably just always keep a can on hand because this stuff really is the best. And in case you're worried I'm overdoing it on gold with this project, I do have some branches here that I'm going to be painting silver. So I also picked these up from Michael's. I didn't really get anything expensive. And here's where it gets confusing. I'm using Montana Gold brand Chrome Effect SIlverChrome Spray Paint. For Montana brand, the top of the can here shows you what color is inside. I don't feel like the silver spray paint is quite as chrome-like as the gold spray paint is. There's something about that that's much more reflective than I felt like the silver was. But it's still better than like Krylon silver spray paint, so. I also found this little rose garland that I liked, and I wanted to use it to make it look like there were some little gilded flowers on the candelabra. But because the flowers are made out of fabric, I sprayed them with Flex Seal first. This thickened up the fabric and made it so that when it was spray painted, each flower looked like it was handcrafted out of sheet metal. This would not be a Christmas tree if we didn't have some shiny ornaments to hang on it. I'm starting with a set of ornaments that I actually found at Target. This is ornament that I found I really liked. It was a mix of gold and like an ambery gold. And I think there actually is probably already enough gold on this tree, so I'm leaning into the amberiness and making the ones that are less ambery more ambery. I'm doing this in a really simple way. I'm taking this Walnut Wood Tone Design Master spray, which you've already seen me use, I think, in every episode so far, and I'm basically just spraying the tops of each of the ornaments to give sort of an ombre effect. It's a little hard to see here on video, but I do think in person it made a difference. I guess I lied about there being enough gold, because the very next thing I did was make a whole bunch of these little golden spindly ornaments that I came up with, and they were really simple to make. I started by ordering these little filigree charm pendant things that are made for jewelry purposes, and then ordered some little filigree cones to go with them. These were nice because they weren't too expensive, and they came with this great little case that holds a whole bunch of different sizes and shapes of cones. For this, I'm just using the longest ones because those are the ones I like the best. I don't know, sometimes it's just that simple. Both the pendants and the cones came in different colors. There was gold, silver, bronze, but for these, I just stuck with the gold. The cones had these little prongs on the end, which were really nice because it meant I could just slide the pendant directly in between them, and they just kind of nested in there pretty perfectly. At first, I just started squeezing the top of the cones with my fingers to make the prongs sort of grab the pendant, but I think after the third or fourth one fell apart, I realized that I should just take pliers and squeeze it that way, and that made a stronger connection. What was nice too is that I ended up not having to use any glue on these, so it not only made it faster in terms of assembly, but I didn't have to wait for them to dry or anything, it didn't make a mess, so it was super easy. I wanted these to be able to hang down low underneath the tree, so rather than hang them with traditional ornament hooks, I grabbed this really thin wire. I think it's 30 gauge, it's barely thicker than a human hair. It's so thin that if you look at my workspace, you'll see that I'm cutting it with a pair of scissors. They're not fabric scissors, I wouldn't do that. Anyway, I threaded a little bit of wire through the top of the ornament, and then I took some of this thin gold chain that I also found at Michael's and wired the ornament to the end of it. I apologize because this part was a little tricky to capture on film because the wire is so thin and I guess my hands were so close to the camera in an effort to try to make it visible what I was doing, but it really is as simple as just like putting the wire through both things and then twisting it a couple times, and then I actually wrapped it around the top of the ornament just a little bit. That way there was a little bit of length to the wire, so when I cut the end, it wasn't a really short stubby bit. That way the likelihood was less that it was going to get pointy enough to be like painful if you grabbed it, because who needs that? In addition to the wire being so thin that it's easy to work with, it also basically disappears to the eye. So this gave me a nice secure connection without having to open and close like a million little O-rings. Also, I promise you these are my trash scissors. I would not be doing this to anything that was like special. But also this chain is really thin and soft, and the scissors were cutting better than the pliers were for some reason. And because I didn't feel like I had enough tiny intricate things to do on this project already, I decided to add a little tiny iridescent rhinestone to the center of each pendant. I don't tend to work with rhinestones a lot, but I know that you're supposed to do it with tweezers, but I couldn't find mine, so I just decided to muscle through and put them all on by hand, which was probably the worst part of this entire project. But I ended up with something that was twinkly and nice, and the rhinestones were the only part that was any kind of trouble. By the way, since I don't think I mentioned it, the metal that these pendants and cones were made out of is super soft, really flexible. You see how easily it bends. And because it's so agreeable, I've used this kind of stuff on props and puppets and costume jewelry, and even down to like making tiny wrought iron for little models. They're made out of iron, but it's pressed so thin that it feels like the equivalent of maybe a couple layers of aluminum foil. It just bends like it's nothing. I made about a dozen of these little ornaments for this tree, and I think it took a little bit less than half an hour for me to put them all together. Maybe a little bit more if you count the rhinestones. But that's only because I chose to do that part in the most inefficient way. Sometimes it's nice on a project like this to have an element where you can just sort of veg out and do things over and over and over, and it's repetitious and it's little. A lot of the things that I tend to make are big and unique and weird, and you don't get a moment of zen like you get with this, where you can just sort of fall into the process and look, and suddenly you've got a whole bunch of things done that are detailed and tiny and surprising. By the way, for anybody who's noticed, I apologize for the state of my hands and my fingernails in this clip, because I had just done the Flex Seal step from the cast iron and couldn't properly get my hands clean before I dove right into this, so thank you for your understanding. Because I wasn't willing to risk that this tree did not have enough tiny sparkly elements, I made some other funny little ornaments that are really almost more like pieces of jewelry just hanging down from the tree. I got these little faceted beads, also from Michaels, and then just took some more of that really thin wire and threaded it through some more of that tiny gold chain from before. It was important to me to be able to hang things at different levels from the different arms and branches of this candelabra. Normally with a live Christmas tree, the branches are already so dense that kind of does a lot of the work for you. But unlike nature, this candelabra has its arms spaced at really regular intervals. So having these chains attached to everything really let me get specific about how high or low I wanted to hang things relative to those fixed points. Anyway, once I stuck that wire through the center of the bead, I took these little silver beads and used them as like a cap on the end. This is probably a level of detail that nobody was really looking for, but I made sure that the bead and the wire were both silver so that when I wrapped the wire back around that bead to sort of close things off, the wire blended in with the bead so you couldn't readily see quite how it was attached. It just sort of looked like there was a little perfect silver ball right there on the end. I wanted each of these ornaments I was creating to feel like a perfect little piece of jewelry that was more expensive than it actually was, so little things like that I think helped give that impression. Then I just wrapped the excess wire around like the other ornaments so it would be less stabby. I did at one point try a slight variation on this assembly that didn't make a huge difference, but might be a slightly cleaner way of doing things. So what I did instead was I started by putting the wire through the silver bead instead of putting it through the chain. Then I fed that through the sparkly bead, and then when that came out on the other side, then I fed it through the end of the chain. So the main difference is just that the excess ends up at the top of the sparkly bead by the chain rather than down by the silver bead at the bottom, which on a project like this where there are meant to be so many different shiny things to look at is probably not really much of a difference, but if you're doing something that is meant to be inspected up close, maybe it's better to have it one way instead of the other. And by the way, in case anybody thinks I have anything against like actual ornament hooks, I don't. That's totally how I'm going to be attaching some of these ornaments to the tree, at least the ones that are attached in places where the hooks won't be visible. Another one of the great benefits of this chain is that you can adjust the height at which you're hanging your ornament just by placing the hook in a different link. Now it's time to start decorating the tree. For some of the bigger elements being attached to this candelabra, I'm using thicker gold wire. This wire is thick enough that I have to use pliers. Sorry, scissors, you have to rest. Wiring things to the tree like this will let me get really specific about where things are positioned, but will make it so that it's not impossible to remove them later in case I ever just want to use this as like a candelabra again. I'm just cutting lengths of wire a couple inches long and then wrapping them around the different branches that I'm adding to the tree. Some of the branches themselves have wire inside them, so it makes them a little bit posable, which is really nice just to be able to reposition things after the fact. For some of the longer branches, I made a point of attaching them at 2 or even 3 points, but for the little tiny things like this, little sprigs can just go on with 1. Depending on the thickness of the wire you're using to do something like this, it can be good to wear gloves or even just use pliers to do all the twisting, which I ended up doing in a couple places where I felt like I really needed it, but for the most part, the wire I was using was soft enough that it wasn't so bad. I did, however, at one point pull out this really thick wire that I didn't use to attach anything to the tree. I just wanted to add a few more like curlicue flourishes, so I just kind of bent things into curved shape and wrapped it around. It's a little hard to tell in this lighting, but the wire itself is silver, and part of the reason that I made a point of using gold and silver accents on this tree came down to how I'm gonna light it at the end. And again, being able to position things after the fact is a real blessing with something like this. To affix both halves of my faux cast iron arms together, I'm just going to use my glue gun. For something simple like this that isn't structural, you can glue wood with hot glue, but that's mainly just because this is a cosmetic element and it's not actually holding any meaningful weight. If you're trying to glue pieces of wood together for a structural project, use wood glue. But this isn't that, and I was in a rush, so hot glue dries much faster than wood glue, and so I just went for it. I have no idea why this shot is so long. It's probably just because I liked looking at how shiny it was. To secure this onto the candelabra itself, I'm just using that gold wire from before. I wrapped the wire around a couple times in a couple different places, and I made sure to tie it off really tight because I wanted it to be nice and secure as something that was going to be holding a candle. Even though it's a fake candle and there would be no danger if it fell, I just didn't want that to happen. You can see here, I actually did go back in with the pliers here just to make sure it was really secure in the couple different places where I attached it. This got harder to do as I added more things to the tree, so make sure you add the important stuff first. Then, once the biggest, most structural elements were in place, I went in with some of the more cosmetic elements. Part of the reason I mentioned wearing gloves isn't because any of the twisting that I had to do here was particularly hard, but just because when you're doing something repetitive like that over and over and over and over, it really starts to catch up with you, and your fingers are delicate, so be gentle with them. You can see here again the advantage of having some of these things wired together. Being able to reposition stuff like that is so freeing. I made sure to attach each of those fake cast iron arms individually. I didn't want it so that they were all tied together where I risked that if one fell, they all fell. In fact, that was a big thing I tried to do throughout this entire project. I tried to make sure that instead of attaching something to something that was attached to the candelabra, I tried to attach things to the candelabra itself as much as was possible. That way it minimized the risk of any sort of domino effect where one thing started to come loose and therefore everything attached to it came loose. It was just nice to know that everything was kind of secure to the one big structural element. I made a point of not setting out with too solid a plan when I went to go decorate this tree. I think part of the fun sometimes of decorating a Christmas tree is just like seeing how it happens, and even something unique like this, I really wanted to have the freedom to change my mind as I was going. That meant sometimes I looked at places that I thought were resolved, but then after I added a few more things, realized that it could use something else over here, so having some raw materials around let me be creative on the fly. Lighting is of course going to be one of the most massively important elements of this project. I set up 2 cube lights with colored gel on opposite sides of the tree to really help bring out the silver and gold accents. Something that I wish I'd done was set up those lights earlier, because I think that probably would have helped me figure out where exactly all the different elements should be placed to maximize the impact of the lighting. See what I mean about it getting more difficult to position things after you've added other stuff onto it? Something I didn't really think of until I was doing it was hanging ornaments off of these quote-unquote cast iron branches. I had some bigger gauge chain left over that I'd used to make some of the costume jewelry for the Sanderson sisters for Halloween, and I used that for these ornaments. I found the most seamless way to hang these was to pull the pin out of the ornament, loop it through the chain, and then stick the pin back into place. And then I ran a little bit of wire through the other end of the chain and then just wrapped that around the arm of the candelabra. I had a bunch of these little silver sprigs left over that were great for filling out places that seemed like they needed it. To hang those little gold spindles I made earlier, I just used regular silver ornament hooks because they were hidden by the branches that they were hanging from, so it didn't really matter what it looked like at the top, as long as the presentation at the bottom was really clean. As a pretty late find, I ended up getting these plastic icicles from Dollar Tree. They came in bigger and smaller sizes, so I got a pack of each, and I really loved the way that they looked, and I thought they really complemented the spindles. I tried not to go overboard with the traditional ornaments. I actually didn't use all the ones that came in that pack from Target. I just used a couple in strategic places where I felt more mass was needed. I had also at one point ordered some glass icicles from somewhere, but I think the plastic ones from Dollar Tree ended up looking better. For some finishing touches, I added just a few more things to try to catch just a little bit more light. I ordered a pack of some simple chandelier crystals online, and a few of them I attached to a chain, and some of them I just kind of hung directly off of the candelabra itself. I didn't glue these down in any sort of capacity, which is something I'm gonna have to remember when I go to move this thing at the end of the season, or there will be crystals everywhere. I also noticed late in the game there were a few fake pine cones that I had left from some of the sprigs, and I just plucked them off and hot glued them in a couple places. And just because there was one more opportunity to make things sparkle, I had some of those iridescent rhinestones left over, and I just kind of stuck them in places pretty indiscriminately around the candelabra. But of course, the most important finishing touch is the tree topper, which was very simple. I just took a plastic snowflake from Dollar Tree and glued it onto one of the candles.